While Nottingham's black gangs succumbed to the lure of crack cocaine, eventually imploding, certain white criminals were making a very tidy profit. One team was led by two brothers, Wayne and Dean Hardy, who had started off helping to run their father's profitable scrap metal firm and ended up with a multi-million-pound drug dealing business. These men, who preferred to use their fists rather than resort to firepower, and by staying out of the street gang culture, were able to make millions from a variety of illicit trades. There was also the element of a morality to their drug dealing. Cannabis, amphetamines and ecstasy were fine, but they never got involved with heroin. Their biggest profit were through the contraband of the cigarette trade, which at one point was bringing in £70,000 a week. The brothers were always one step ahead of HM Custom. Even when a load was busted, there were several others going through at the same time, which ensured that they were never out of pocket. Wayne Hardy was helped by an all-powerful figure. For the purposes of this story, shall be called the Taxman. During the early 1990s, when ecstasy sales boomed, recreational pills and amphetamines were being down like candy. Wayne Hardy was one of the major suppliers in the city. He came a cropper in 1996, however, after investigative TV reporter Donald McIntyre went undercover as a bouncer and exposed the doorman's true nature in a two-part World in Action program. Despite 9 months of undercover filming, it was not the expose it had hoped to be, and showed nothing more than doormen dealing speed, taking steroids and working out at the gym. Ironically, the biggest drug deal that takes place on film is where Mr. McIntyre himself splashes out several £100s on a ball of cocaine straight off the block, delivered to him by a nervous looking black youth. Mr. McIntyre had hoped to entice Mr. Hardy into a major drug deal, but the drugs went missing when Mr. McIntyre handed over the coke to one of Mr. Hardy's associates, who dutifully told Mr. McIntyre he had to throw it out the car window one evening because the police were following him. The impact the program had was mixed. It didn't bring down Wayne Hardy, though it did put the heat on him. A large number of bouncers lost their job, only to be re-employed later, and Mr. Hardy carried on his exploits. A year later, however, the police did catch up with him when he was busted as he drove back to his flat in Aston Hall in Derbyshire with 25 kilos of cannabis resin. After pleading guilty in September 1998, he was sent down for 3.5 years. And a £104,000 confiscation order was placed on his assets. It was pin money to a man who would later have a property portfolio worth millions, with houses in Florida, Cape Town, and interests in a diamond mine. After living for a while in South Africa, he returned to Nottingham in 2005 and was approached by Donald McIntyre to participate in a follow-up program 10 years on from the 1996 sting. But tragedy, which had a habit of pursuing Mr. Hardy, struck as talks about the film got underway. He had already had to deal with a girlfriend who killed their young child and then committed suicide, and a daughter who was addicted to heroin. Then his brother Dean, who had also been approached to take part in the program, was killed by a lorry on Trent Bridge after stumbling into the road just hours after meeting with the film crew. The program was finally broadcast in 2007 as part of Mr. McIntyre's Underworld series and was titled Wayne's World 2. It depicted Mr. Wayne as a reformed criminal who was now more interested in helping former associates run pubs such as the Carlton Hotel and the Porchester. A few months before the program went out, Mr. Hardy paid a visit to a man called David Gunn at Full Sutton Prison in North Yorkshire. He was there to ask Mr. Gunn if he could spare the £80,000 for the drugs that he had supplied him before he had been arrested. "When I get out, Wayne, you can have your money," Mr. Gunn told him. "I hope you can help me out too when the time comes." Another white criminal who became a major player during the 1990s and who had also been heavily involved in cigarette smuggling was Robert Briggs Price. A gypsy, Mr. Briggs Price evaded capture for years, even though police knew he was one of the major players in the East Midlands, financing smuggling operations up and down the country. Mr. Briggs Price was a larger-than-life character. He had grown up with his father's scrap metal business, even using a horse and cart to collect items like a character from Steptoe and Son. He could not read or write, at least until prison gave him the opportunity to learn, but he more than made up for it with his sharp mind. He was the life and soul of any party and couldn't stop boasting, which would end up being his downfall. By 1999, he had made millions from smuggling cannabis and particularly cigarettes into the UK. He lived in a £500,000 home at Latcham Hall near Newark, owned the £2.7 million Millgate House Hotel, drove various top-of-the-range cars, and sported a wealth of jewellery. He would invite criminal associates round to play snooker or cards at his 5-bedroom home, where he felt business could be discussed safely in the relaxed surroundings of a home, which boasted a swimming pool and the best security system available. A customs operation was already underway targeting Mr. Briggs Price cigarette smuggling enterprise, and Nottinghamshire police had called in the same mysterious experts they had used in Operation Odin to plant electronic bugs in his property. They wanted to nail him for the drug running. In the summer of 1999, police set up Operation Long Island, the beginning of a major probe into Mr. Briggs Price's firm. Special Forces operatives broke into his home and placed a bug in his favourite armchair. Devices were also hidden in headrests in his Mercedes and Range Rover. Video surveillance was placed on one of the warehouses he used in Bourton, Nottinghamshire, where contraband cigarettes were being taken, and through one of Mr. Briggs Price's associates, they infiltrated his gang with an undercover officer. The bugs caught Mr. Briggs Price boasting about bringing in a ton of cannabis every month, as well as other criminal ventures. Police knew that Mr. Briggs Price was smuggling cannabis, but when they heard on the bugs that an associate of his, John Barton, was looking for business partners to help bring in 100 keys of heroin, they decided they could capitalise on the plan by using an undercover man. Mr. Barton had extensive drug contacts in Holland and wanted to use Mr. Briggs Price's illicit transport network to smuggle £10 million worth of heroin. An undercover officer who went by the name of Jerry was introduced to one of Mr. Briggs Price's associates, and one evening he was invited over to Latcham Hall. Posing as a drug smuggler, Jerry brought with him £200,000 in a bin bag, which he said was to pay off someone else in a nearby car park deal. At the house, Jerry began counting out the money in full view of Mr. Briggs Price. Mr. Briggs Price's curiosity got the better of him, and soon he was asking Jerry whether he wanted to come in on a deal with him to bring some hard stuff into the country. Jerry told him he had a good transport connection through an Irishman called Sean, who was in fact another undercover cop, and said he would be interested. More discussions took place over the subsequent weeks until Mr. Briggs Price was sold on the idea. He told Mr. Barton to get in touch with Sean and go over to Ireland to get it all sorted out. But someone smelled a rat, and Mr. Barton told undercover officers that there were some problems with the shipment at its source in Holland. After a week of silence, Mr. Barton made no further contact. On the 21st of June 2000, police decided they could wait no longer and swooped on a number of addresses, arresting 49-year-old Mr. Briggs Price and 48-year-old Mr. Barton in the process. Mr. Briggs Price was alerted to the police raid when officers shouted through a megaphone for him to come out. He peered out the window of his property, looking perplexed about what was going on. Police had surrounded the place with armed officers, closing off Great North Road, while the rotor blade on a helicopter whirled above. Mr. Briggs Price eventually appeared at the front door, hands above his head, looking tanned in a Hawaiian shirt and shorts. He had just returned from a holiday in Florida. It was something like Out of Miami Vice, only the weather was not up to scratch. The case took more than 2 years to come to court because of the complications over the transcripts of the bug material. But when it did, Mr. Briggs Price felt the full weight of the law. In 2003, he was jailed for 17 years for heroin conspiracy and 4.5 years, 8 million cigarettes that he had brought in. Mr. Barton was sentenced to 19 years for heroin conspiracy, but had amazingly been given bail by a judge and absconded. He is yet to be arrested, but was last rumoured to be working alongside the drugs cartels in Spain. Mr. Briggs Price has also endured the biggest assets recovery investigation ever undertaken by Nottinghamshire police. The financial investigators eventually slapped him with a £4.5 million bill, which if not paid would result in extra time in prison. By now, investigators were beginning to make some clear dents in the organised crime structure which had been flooding the city with drugs. Major players had been taken out, with the convictions of Dave Francis, Robert Briggs Price and Wayne Hardy. The threat posed by the Yardie gangs had diminished slightly, and some of the posses who had been controlling the NG Triangle were either spent or had taken the eyes off the ball. By 2001, however, a white crime family was slowly building up its influence in the north of the city. This family appeared on the surface to be unsophisticated, lacking the desire to go beyond their geographical boundaries and living up to their image as a mere council estate thug. Yet the fact was, unbeknownst to the police at the time, they had already begun to fill the vacuum left by other crime groups, which had been dismantled. They had also forged links with another crime family in the north of Nottinghamshire, and were about to unleash a wave of violence upon the city. Led by Colin Gunn, the Bestwood Cartel was about to make itself known. On a cold, dark January evening in 2000, a landlord was called out from his home by a tenant. The landlord, Kevin Musgrove, had been pestered all day by complaints about a broken window to the rear of his property in High Street, Kimberley. His tenant was Godfrey Hibbert, someone Mr. Musgrove had got to know through dealings at the garage he owned. Mr. Hibbert would pop in now and again to get his car tuned up, but there was one thing Mr. Musgrove didn't know about Mr. Hibbert, a former heavyweight boxer. He was a prolific criminal and had been one of the main players with Dave Francis in the Meadows posse. One day, Mr. Hibbert overheard Mr. Musgrove talking in his garage about problems he was having getting a tenant, and said he might know some people who were looking to rent. A deal was done and the tenants moved in, with Mr. Hibbert acting as their guarantor. Mr. Musgrove thought nothing more of it. He never met the tenants themselves, and there were a few weeks when the rent didn't come through, and he had complained to Mr. Hibbert, but Mr. Hibbert always sorted it out. Then Mr. Musgrove received a call about a window and eventually agreed to take a look at it and see if it could be easily fixed. When he arrived, Mr. Hibbert was waiting outside. When Mr. Musgrove noticed the broken window, he decided to go inside and take a better look. The doors proved difficult to open, but eventually they got in, and they were confronted by a property which appeared bare and unlived in. "Looks like they've gone," said Mr. Musgrove. "Done a runner by the looks. But what am I going to do about the rent? You vouched for them, Mr. Godfrey. What are you going to do?" But the rent was not on Mr. Hibbert's mind. He was worried about something else. He knew something of great value had gone missing. Several days earlier, police, supposedly acting on a tip-off from a neighbour who had taken down the registration of Mr. Hibbert's car after seeing suspicious activity at the rented house, had broken in and discovered 300 kilos of cannabis worth a potential £1.4 million. The cannabis had actually been at the property for several weeks, having been moved there from elsewhere in the city. It had been brought in from Leicester from a major dealer called Tony Singh Hare, who was later jailed in a huge Leicestershire police operation. The drugs had been brought by Colin Gunn. Mr. Hibbert, who was using a man called Kevin, not Mr. Musgrove, to babysit the property, was keeping it safe for Mr. Gunn until it could be sold. Having discovered the cannabis, the police moved it and had placed a covert camera and listening device in the building, hoping to catch the owners of the drugs. Although it has never been publicly confirmed, the police almost certainly caught someone after they raided the house on an earlier day. Perhaps the Kevin who was merely minding the drugs for Mr. Gunn and Mr. Hibbert had turned himself as an informant to help catch the bigger fish. Mr. Hibbert was well known to the police and had already been into the property earlier that day. The video camera showed him clearly walking into the house at 1:40 PM and putting his hand to his mouth once he realised the cannabis was missing. So why did the police wait 5 more hours for Mr. Musgrove to turn up? They would say later that they had missed Mr. Hibbert going into the property and the raid that took place at the first opportunity they had to make any arrests. At around 7 PM and on the 10th of January, within a few minutes of the two men going inside, officers from Operation Firecracker swooped in. They had no evidence or intelligence that Mr. Musgrove was a drug dealer, and he answered all their questions dutifully. He was not told about the bug and was not aware of it until a later date, but all his answers were honest. Mr. Musgrove was, as he later described in court, a person of good character. However, he was charged with conspiracy to supply Class B drugs, though he was shocked by his arrest and the charges laid by the police. Mr. Musgrove, at this point, still had faith in the justice system. He was sure that the jury would be able to see that he was no drug dealer, but voice analysis experts, at least one whom was professionally discredited on a later case, were allowed to make claims about the bug conversation, and the jury was allowed to make conclusions about a moment when two men talk in whispers for a few seconds, implying they both knew that there was a bug in the property. Surprisingly, Mr. Musgrove was found guilty along with Mr. Hibbert. After the High Street bust, officers were immediately able to gain a search warrant for Mr. Hibbert's small jewellery shop, Go Fast, which is in St. James Street, where after a second search, the first having been fruitless despite the presence of sniffer dogs, they found around £200,000 worth of heroin stashed in the alcove. Though he was certainly involved in the cannabis shipment and had a long criminal record, Mr. Hibbert was not a known major heroin dealer and claimed to believe that the heroin had been planted there. He suspected someone had set him up. Mr. Musgrove received an 8-year sentence at Nottingham Crown Court, and Mr. Hibbert 10 years for the cannabis and 13 years at a later date for the heroin seizure. After the two were found guilty and led down to the cells, two burly men came to see Mr. Hibbert. The pair were heard by people in the custody area, thanking him for not saying anything and indicated that they would look after his family while he was locked up. The men were the brothers, Colin and David Gunn. After just a few weeks in prison, Mr. Musgrove began asking a lot of questions about who was behind this drug shipment. He got some answers and he started to rattle some cages. Meanwhile, his wife Diane, who had no doubt about her husband's innocence, put posters and sheet banners around the local area with the words "Kevin Musgrove is innocent" to draw attention to the injustice that she had no doubt had been inflicted upon her husband and family. The posters attracted a lot of attention, and news of the campaign reached Colin Gunn. He dispatched 4 men to Mr. Musgrove's home, armed with baseball bats, and Diane and her teenage son were severely beaten. "Tell that fat bastard husband of yours to keep his mouth shut," one of the thugs warned her. "You put any more banners up and we'll kill you both." That same evening, Kevin Musgrove's garage was razed to the ground. The insurance company later told him that his insurance was nullified because of his recent conviction. A few days later, Diane Musgrove was summoned to a gym by her son, where some men were waiting to meet her. She was told to answer a mobile phone which was given to her. On the other end was a voice she did not recognise, but she was told it was Colin Gunn. "Tell your husband to keep his mouth shut or there will be more of the same," he said. Luckily for the police, the raiders had left the baseball bat behind, mistakenly picking up one in the house which was owned by her son as they left. It had DNA on it and it could be identified to one of her assailants. After a few weeks, the baseball bat went missing from the police's exhibits. No one was able to find it. Kevin Musgrove eventually served 4 years in prison. When he came out on parole, Assets investigators demanded £200,000, which they said was his share of the original value of the cannabis, even though the cannabis was never his and he never made nothing from the sale of illegal drugs. When a researcher met him, he had not long completed his sentence and therefore did not, on the surface, seem to be a great deal to explore. He had been convicted, after all, by a jury of 12 people, true and good, but once he had finished telling his story to the researcher, he had no doubt that a serious miscarriage of justice had taken place. His greatest crime was to be naive in not checking out the tenant of his property. The police asked him why he hadn't checked up on his tenant with regular visits. This may be a priority in the current age of hydroponic cannabis growing factories in rented properties, but this was 2000 and such checks were only made then by the utmost circumspect of landlords. The evidence on which he was convicted was circumstantial at best, and though Mr. Musgrove's legal team was given disclosure in the case, they believed that there should have been more video footage from the surveillance book. They also suspect that there was a participating informant used by the police, which was not disclosed by his defence team. More information emerged about Mr. Musgrove's miscarriage of justice after the first publication of his book. A deal had indeed been done between a police officer and Colin Gunn, which would brokered through a solicitor used by Mr. Gunn. Mr. Gunn would tell them about the drugs found in the house in Kimberley if he was given a favourable outlook on his own case, which there had been an arrest warrant issued after he failed to answer bail on grievously body harm charges over a fight outside the Astoria nightclub in 1998. Secondly, questions were also being asked about why the judge who had heard the original outline of the prosecution case against Kevin Musgrove during his first few appearances at Nottingham Crown Court in February and March 2000, and who had told the prosecution in open court he would not countenance the use of a serious drug dealer as an informant, was replaced with another judge before the case went to trial. A submission regarding these matters and others which raise serious questions over the handling of Mr. Musgrove's case is being drawn up for the Criminal Cases Review Commission, which will decide whether it will refer it to the Court of Appeal. He had to sell everything to pay for a drug debt, which wasn't his. He no longer has a garage and has to use the facilities of a friend, but more than anything else, he is desperate to prove his innocence. If Mr. Musgrove's case is placed alongside that of another drugs case which took place earlier in the year, the injustice seems even more acute. In the spring of 1999, custom investigators had been tracking a large shipment of cannabis and amphetamine from a French HGV all the way off of a ferry of Dover. Part of the shipment had been destined to go to the Guns and their Bestwood cartel. Customs men trailed a van which came off the ferry from Calais and watched closely as it made its way to Quarry Farm off the A46 near Newark. There, several men began to load the 40-ton lorry and place items into the transit van. With the players seemingly being caught red-handed, the call sign for the strike was given. 6 men were arrested at the scene, and the custom officers then moved in to survey the smuggled goods. At first they believed they had a 300-kilo haul of cocaine and cannabis. Only later, after analysis, the drugs were properly identified. Altogether there was 156 packages of cannabis and 258 packages of amphetamine sulfate, with a street value of around £4.3 million. The trial was eventually scheduled to take place in Manchester the following year. All the paperwork was completed, and in due course, it would be for the jury to decide the defendant's guilt or innocence. The defendants included a former Nottingham police officer who, according to the evidence given in court, was seen unloading the lorry and helping to load up the transit along with another local man. 4 others from Liverpool, Manchester, West Yorkshire and Blackburn were also in the dock. The case opened at Manchester Crown Court in September 2000, and all seemed to go well until, on the 3rd day, the prosecution and defence teams asked to see Judge Michael Henschel in his chambers. 2 days of legal discussions then began behind closed doors. Then the judge called the jury back into the court and explained that they would not have to sit through the trial any further, or be called upon to make a judgment of any evidence they had heard so far. The prosecutors were throwing in the towel. It was a further day before the customs investigators had anything to say in public, and when they did, no one was any the wiser to what lay behind all of it. Peter Hollier, a senior customs and exercise investigation officer, defended the decision as best he could, but some felt there was a hollow ring to his words. "This is an internal customs and exercise decision," he told reporters. "We have stayed proceedings. This means they will not stand trial. It was a major boost seizing the drugs before they got onto the streets, and we put a lot of effort into the case. But we are sure this is the right decision." Clearly, there must have been a good reason why the case of Kevin Musgrove had gone ahead, despite there being no evidence of a business partnership between Mr. Hibbert and Mr. Musgrove, other than the tenancy of number 1 High Street. If any suspicions had been raised about the participating informant, then it is unlikely that Mr. Musgrove would have stood trial, and clearly there was a very good reason why Customs chose to stay the prosecution in the case of the Newark drug trial, but no one seemed able or willing to explain to the general public. The likelihood is that it was also connected in some way with another case, or an informant whose position could have been jeopardised by the Newark's case going ahead. But there was one other common thread running through this, aside from the likelihood of informants being used. In both cases, the drugs were destined for Colin Gunn, and yet in neither of the cases was anyone from the Bestwood cartel ever in the dock. This was to be a story which will be repeated a number of times in the future. When Robert Briggs Price was under surveillance during 1999 and 2000, a number of calls were intercepted from a phone linked to Colin Gunn, but National Crime Squad operatives who were responsible for monitoring all the calls going in and out to Mr. Briggs Price wrote off the material, saying it had not been possible to decipher what was contained in the conversation. By the year 2000, there appeared to be some kind of force field around Colin Gunn that prevented the law enforcement agencies getting anywhere near him. The police in Nottingham were also fighting a second front in the form of another outbreak of black-on-black gun crime in the city centre, and had set up a specialist team, as Scotland Yard had done with Operation Trident, to try and tackle the problem. It was called Operation Stealth, and whilst manpower was concentrated at Operation Stealth, there were few eyes watching what was going on in Bestwood. David and Colin Gunn grew up initially in Eastwood. In part, they were cliched by products of single-parent families, along with another brother, Andy, and a sister, Julie. Their father had left the family home when they were young, and they lacked a stable male role model. When the opportunity arose to move to Bestwood, their mother, Carol Mills, who later married a man named Stephen Hudson, grabbed at the chance. Bestwood, once a mining village, but now a sprawling post-war estate of red brick and semi-detached homes, had properties on the northern edge of Nottingham. This would later become their base. Colin, in particular, would come to dislike migrating anywhere outside of it. One event in their formative years gives an early clue to the contradictions within them. As teenagers, they appeared in the local church magazine article which praised their crime-busting heroic. A street robber had attacked the woman and made off with her purse. Colin and Dave gave chase, apprehended the man before giving the thankful woman her purse back. How accurate the report incident is must be open to criticism, but at the same time, as they were apparently battling crime on the streets, they were known as bruisers in the playground at Henry Whipple Junior School, where David met his future, now estranged wife, Sandy. In those early days, the older David had a more fearsome reputation. He and his family had moved from Eastwood, and I was the gaffer, like the main girl at the school. He was a bit cheeky to me, and we had a bit of a fight. I won, and we decided that we quite liked each other, she told Nottingham Evening Post. By the time they reached Padstow Comprehensive School, Colin was fast catching up. A fellow pupil, Colin Gunn was a bully in chief, intimidating others with his cold, steely eyes. If anyone stared at him too long, he would come over and beat the living daylights out of them, said one ex-pupil. Even then, he seemed paranoid. If you got on with him, then you became part of his gang and he would protect you. He never excelled at anything at school except bullying and fighting in the playground and having his mates around him to show he had a bit of power. He took some of the lessons he learned in the playground with him. One thing that stands out is that none of the other kids would ever think to grass him up. Even then, he knew how to use the power of fear over other people. By the time he was only in his teens, Colin was already carrying out burglaries on the local estate and mixing with older people who were veterans of credit card and cheque fraud. It was his financial dealings that first got him into trouble. He was part of a gang run by another family with whom he would remain in close contact with in later years. The scam was run by one of the Dawes family, who later based themselves in Sutton and Ashfield in the north of Nottinghamshire, and it ran into the tens of thousands of pounds. Colin, then in his late teens, received his first custodial sentence of 6 months. One young officer who interviewed him at the time said there was nothing in his nature to mark him out from the scores of other criminals doing the same thing. He was just an average, run-of-the-mill, petty criminal. He didn't seem bothered at all that he had been arrested, or that he was looking at prison time for the first time in his life. If anything, he was probably looking forward to it, in the sense of being a badge of honour. At around the same age, David was arrested, but no charges followed, though he was later to be convicted of other crimes, including threats to kill and possession of an offensive weapon. By the early 1990s, with both in their mid-20s, David and Colin were steadily clocking up convictions such as burglary, theft, handling stolen goods, and violence. Like other fledgling criminal gangs, they built up their enterprise by banking on the people they had grown up with and who they could trust. Most were from the estate, though there were others from Sherwood and even further afield who had good drug supply connections in Leicestershire. Some were minions, but would later rise to be lieutenants in the command tree of the criminal group, like Jamie Neal, who came from a gypsy stock. Others were already well respected and trusted by Colin. Men such as Dave Baz Barnett and Kevin Warsaw. All of them would play their part in helping control various criminal activities on their path. For each person who swore loyalty to the brothers, there was an extended family in all sorts of jobs who could help them out. It was mad. Like you could find out anything, said one of the former associates. Someone had a relative in the council who had access to this or that, could find out where so-and-so had been moved to, if they owed a debt, and if they needed to be tracked down. Somebody else's girlfriend worked for the social services. So-and-so had a couple of mates working for the British Telecom. It was all that kind of thing. If you wanted to find someone, it was no bother. You could trace just about anybody. And the beauty of it was, people were doing favours, never really knew what they were ultimately doing for the criminal enterprises. They were our friends. Colin and David soon realised that for all the brawn needed to maintain the standing of the Bestwood cartel, they also needed crucial information. The growing army proved itself useful in all sorts of ways, and the brothers too were united. You knew you couldn't upset either Colin or David if you wanted a quiet life, said the former associate. They looked after each other, and they were pretty close in those days. David would be the only one who could get away with taking the piss out of Colin. Colin had this kind of compulsive, obsessive fear thing about dirty ashtrays and fag ends, and one stunt David would pull would be to fill up Colin's coat pockets in the pub with the contents of various ashtrays while he went off to the bog. When he came back in, David would just sit there and watch as his brother found out what was in his coat pockets. Colin would go berserk until David was able to calm him back down. On the other hand, some say that David was the one who got Colin into coke big time, and that was a big mistake. Colin was forging stronger links with crime families he had previously been involved with in the cheque fraud. It was run by the brothers John and Rob Dawes and their friend Gary Hardy, the son of a Hell Angels leader in North Nottinghamshire. Colin was also talking deals with people like Robert Biggs Price and John Paul Allen, a major dealer from Woodthorpe in Nottingham. Mr. Allen was eventually jailed following a drugs bust and went on to receive life sentences for ordering the shooting of a young associate, Ian Taylor, who Mr. Allen wrongly believed was about to grass him up. David Gunn, meanwhile, was cementing links with other major criminals like Wayne Hardy, who was of no relation to Gary Hardy. Wayne Hardy had supplied amphetamines and cannabis at wholesale to the cartel, and Jonathan Donnie Quinn, who was trying to build up a drugs and tobacco smuggling operation with criminals in Sheffield and Doncaster areas of South Yorkshire. The Gunn brothers stepped up in their criminal activities in Bestwood, nearby in Bulwell and Arnold. On leaving school, Colin worked as a doorman and soon discovered that this was a good way to supply recreational drugs to those who wanted them. He gave the job up though, after he was on the receiving end of a beating, losing some teeth outside one venue in a fight with somebody who had no respect for the reputation that preceded the brothers. It wasn't the only fight he lost. After a few incidences when Colin and David got battered, though mainly Colin, they grew to hate the city centre, said one associate. Colin in particular felt vulnerable when he went into town. He expected people to respect him, but of course, to other players in the city, he was just a nobody from Bestwood, and he was inevitably a target for bruisers who were a bit more tastier than him. You had people like the Taxman and the Hardy brothers, who had already had a massive reputation of being able to look after themselves around the city, and their domain was Carlton, Sneinton and the city centre. It was about this time that Colin got sick of going into the city centre and ended the evening with a fight. He started to get this attitude of, well fuck 'em, I'll show 'em what I can do on my own patch. And for the most part, Colin Gunn did stick to his own patch. By the late 1990s, he was running a large operation which spanned money lending, burglaries, extortion, robberies, drugs, car ringing and fraud. He enforced his leadership with extreme violence. Colin was also beginning to use police officers extensively, something some knew and others didn't. His corruption of officers had started in an innocent fashion. He would pass on information to a few well-known officers in return for favours. Many justified giving information back to him on the basis that they believed there was bigger fish to catch, and the information he was giving them was grade A1. Some even felt that the Gunns were looking after the estate. The brothers even had a safe house where they stored drugs in the city, looked after by an officer who lived nearby. He would warn them if any other potential raids were coming up at the property. The relationship with the police officers was self-serving. It gave Colin Gunn the means by which he could take out the competitors by passing on tip-offs about drugs or cigarette shipments that were coming in. It also kept the police and other law enforcement agencies away from his own activities to an extent. There were fringe benefits as well, since the closer that the cartel got to some officers, the more they learned about police methods. They could then pinpoint flaws which could be exploited and used as leverage if they ever needed to get themselves out of a sticky situation. Police officers were also only human. It was only a matter of time before some of the more weak-willed might be compromised by something. They came into a variety of guises. Some were tired detectives from the old school, waiting to clock up their 30 service for the pension and had forgotten what they had joined the police for. Their weaknesses also came in diverse forms, from greed to dependence, to selfishness to naivety. The limitations of their standards meant they could easily succumb to a line of cocaine or a prostitute. In 2001, such was Colin Gunn's reputation as a provider of good information, that he was trailed by a police officer with a National Crime Squad background. The officer wanted to become a registered informant, but questions were asked when the application went in. One officer said, with all the information that was coming in from an army of people who were effectively working for him, he must have begun to think he'd become invincible. Certainly by 2001, he was approaching a better network of intelligence than even the police had. There had been a rule change in the use of informants. Mr. Gunn and his crew were recruiting like there was a war about to happen. By this time, Colin, who had been on steroids for more than a decade, was also regularly using cocaine. Colin's use of extreme violence was itself becoming like a drug. He craved seeing fear in his victims' faces and took pleasure in inflicting extreme pain upon men or women. Incidences began to filter through the police about tortures being used on people. There was a man who Colin thought was going to grass him up. He was taken to a remote area outside Bestwood and his hands were nailed to a wooden bench. He was then saturated in petrol while Colin toyed with a flame. It was almost as if he loved playing out the gangster role movie. He seemed to get a bigger kick out of seeing dread in people's eyes. And if they expected to get a beating or worse, then who was he to disagree with the penalty? His favourite punishment for those that displeased him, and sometimes it was over £100 or less, was to have the person kidnapped and then taken somewhere quiet out of the way, said a former associate. Colin would then turn up and that person would have their hands held down while Colin got a hammer or a baseball bat out the boot of the car. Colin would smash one knuckle and then get someone to hold down the other one, and he would say, "Don't flinch. If you flinch, you get it on the other one. Nobody rips me off, do you understand?" This happened on a regular basis, and believe me, they never displeased him ever again. As far as Colin was concerned, they always looked guilty when they eyeballed him and saw how scared they were, so he took that as a sign. People who were on the receiving end of his almost psychopathic violence would rarely go to the police, and if they did, they soon got a visit from a member of the Bestwood cartel. A police officer who dealt with the Bestwood cartel said, by the late 90s, they were running protection rackets all over Bestwood. The fact that shopkeepers and businessmen don't talk about it to this day is a testament to the fear that was being created. Their modus operandi was to visit the business and ask to see the gaffer. Often the businessmen would just shrug off the initial visit and send them packing. That same evening, something would happen to the business. It was either burgled, or the windows would be shot up, or it would be attacked by arsonists. Most of the businessmen paid. Those that didn't received a second visit, and Colin would drive up past the business, call out the gaffer, and make a gun finger with his hand and point at the boss. It usually achieved the desired effect. One scam that Colin had masterminded was the kidnap of a criminal associate, which was to bring the cartel more than £200,000. The associate, who dealt in a little cocaine and cannabis, but mainly made his money from large-scale cigarette smuggling, owed Colin and David some money which had been lent out on a property he was buying. He was already paying them £1,000 a week protection money to allow him to trade in various criminal enterprises on their patch, and call on the henchmen for any business problem. Colin took the house as part payment on the debt, which was worth close to £200,000, and then, with the agreement of the associate himself, had him kidnapped by a gang of gypsies, who drugged him and obeyed to the order to rough him up for a while with some relish. The businessman's Spanish-based father and some of his criminal associates put some of it going back to the kidnapped victim himself. According to former associates, Colin Gunn also had a penchant for teenage girls. If he took a fancy to someone on a night out and they were with their boyfriend, Mr. Gunn would go up to the young man and simply tell him he had two choices. Either the girl went home with him or he had to take a beating. He was also fiercely protective of anyone who had relationship problems. Anyone finishing a relationship with one of the junior members of the extended family would be looking over their shoulders if they choose to move on to someone new. Most learned not to incur Colin Gunn's wrath, but if he found out and they were still living on the estate, they would be hounded out or they would get a visit threatening violence. Their new relationship carried on. One woman who feared for her life to this day told how she was sought out by Mr. Gunn. I was with a girlfriend of one of his top men at a pub where he was, and he just wouldn't let me leave when she said she wanted to go. And the next thing I remember is waking up the next morning. He'd obviously drugged me, so I haven't got a clue what happened to me. It could have been anything. I know who he was, and I wouldn't have gone anywhere near him, though he had to have drugged me. One night he tried to suffocate her, so she went to the police. It would result in her eventually going into witness protection and being unable to see her young daughter for almost more than a year. They put me into police protection saying I was in danger, but what they were obviously doing was trying to get me to give evidence against him. I wouldn't sign anything because I was too scared. Then they said they got enough evidence so they didn't need my statement. At that same time, I was getting messages passed on to me saying that my family was in danger and that I shouldn't be a naughty girl and say anything, so I had no choice. What can you do when your family's being threatened? I came out and went to stay with a friend in London, but the police tracked me down and told me how worried they were about me. I know there's a bullet with my name on it. I know he's got people all over the country looking for me. Colin used to brag about how he had cops in his pocket, and it's true. During the few weeks I spent with him, he used to tell me about things that would make me shudder. He even told me about this guy who had been fed to the pigs, but when he talked about people who had been killed by his gang, it was just like he was ticking off a things to do list. He'd say, he's gone, as casually as if it was just like they were on holiday, but these people he had actually killed. At the same time, Colin and David were capable of grand acts of compassion, particularly to those families on the estate who had been victims of crime or who were struggling financially, such as the elderly. A number of people tell stories of regular incidents where Colin would pop cash into an envelope and a card, sometimes up to £100, and post it to old people who were celebrating birthdays. One year the brothers paid for a huge firework display on Guy Fawkes Night for all the community to enjoy. One woman didn't have enough money for a cake for her 5-year-old son's birthday, and David popped round and sorted it out. Another elderly woman who had lost her husband and was fearful of being burgled talked about the time Colin came round and put her mind at rest. He told her not to worry and that he would be looking out for her from now on, as he did, as far as she was concerned, because as soon as he was jailed, her house was burgled for the first time. Then there was a couple who had been burgled and lost their jewellery. David came round to see us and he was so polite, said the woman. He took off his shoes at the door and he listened intently to what had happened and the fact we would probably never see the jewellery and stuff again. He said, "Don't worry, we'll sort it out for you. We'll get your stuff back." And he was true to his word. A few days later, we had most of the stuff back. He's a very good lad. The fact was that the cartel's tentacles stretched so far within the criminal world that even if a burglary hadn't been done by their own people, the tales of the returned plunder were not propagated by the people who were part of the cartel. These were genuine, law-abiding citizens who could see little wrong in the Gunn brothers and felt they were looking after the local community. When Colin walked into his local chemist on the estate to get his regular prescription, the queue in the shop would part to let him to the front. As such was the respect he commanded. More than that, people felt the Gunn brothers were doing the job the police should have been doing. This had two consequences. Firstly, it made it difficult for those people to believe the stories they might have heard about the darker side of the Gunn brothers, particularly if it came from the police. Secondly, it bolstered the support that the Gunn brothers were getting, so that every day that passed, the police found it more and more difficult to get a foothold in the estate. If it was an intentional strategy, then it was an act of criminal genius, because it ensured that the Bestwood cartel was perceived by the residents to be the true police force on the estate, the real authority in the community, and a significant number of people stopped ringing the police as a result. In turn, that meant crime figures were also giving a false picture of what was going on in Bestwood. If you had a beef about anything or anyone, you went to Colin and David before you went anywhere else. That was the rule. and that included any police officers who wanted a quiet life. Those that didn't follow the rules didn't get any help, simple as that, and quite often would be targeted under the assumption that they were grasses for the police. In return, what Colin and David did for you, they demanded total loyalty, and often, though not always, would ask for a favour to be returned, at the same time as they were instilling some sense of community, however warped, into the area. They were branching out into areas such as money lending, targeting poor families who needed some extra money for things like Christmas or birthdays, and if the borrower couldn't pay up, then they would come to some other arrangement. Some people's houses were taken over so that drugs could be dealt from them, or hydroponic cannabis farms could be set up. Some were asked to commit crime. A former officer who worked at the nearby Oxclose Lane police station, where the Gunn brothers had a relative working as a cleaner, conceded that by the time the police started to realise what was happening on the estate, it was way too late. We let the area down, and then when we realised the impact that was having, it was too late, he said. It almost became a no-go zone for us. No one wanted to work up there because of the intimidation, so it was a nigh of impossible to get regular beat officers up there who would do the work and get in the community. One time the bosses were getting so much grief about the lack of bobbies on the estate that they offered double time to do patrols, but there were no takers at all. Officers brave enough to take up the crusade against them soon learned the consequences of their actions. Colin and David Gunn had now the means to know where everyone lived. Make no mistake about that, the ex-officer said. One time, there was a detective who had pissed them off, being a bit too good at the job and not checking in with them. They sent someone up there to shoot his windows out. People wanted to do their jobs properly, but what was the cost going to be to them and their families? Colin became increasingly unstable and erratic. He would sometimes explode at the slightest thing, and usually lashed out at the first person he saw. His psychotic alter ego was beginning to surface more frequently than his community-spirited Robin Hood persona, and he was starting to believe in his own myth as a type of real-life Tony Montana in Scarface, an all-seeing, all-powerful man who could control the lives of anybody around him. Colin was breaking the drug dealer's #1 rule: never get high on your own supply. He would gather his selected inner circles to a room in one of the pubs that they controlled and preside over mafia-style boardroom meetings to plan various criminal enterprises and discuss any problems the cartel was having with other criminals. His girlfriend, Victoria Garfoot, who had loyally stood by him since her teens, would regularly complain that they should go and live abroad in a nice house and get away from Bestwood. But Bestwood was everything to Colin. He could be a big fish and everyone would look up to him with respect. The couple, who would have 4 children, would eventually move to a large bungalow in Revelstoke Way near Rise Park with a high-tech security system, electric gates and a gold-plated metal mailbox. But Bestwood was in Colin Gunn's blood. He loved adorning his cars with personalised number plates and had one vehicle fitted with the registration plate Power. His favourite Porsche Carrera was fitted with the number plate Big Un, his nickname to all except his brother, who had now taken to affectionately calling him Fats. The years of steroid abuse were beginning to manifest physical signs. Colin was overweight, as well as being on a short fuse. Colin Gunn made an ill-fated trip to the centre of Nottingham on a stag night in October 1998. He was to be the best man at the wedding of a member of the cartel who collected money for them. Some of the gang, including Colin, travelled into the town for drinks. The group ended up at the Astoria, later the Ocean nightclub near Broadmarsh Centre. Worse for wear from cocktail of drugs and drinks, Colin got into his usual dispute with a reveller whose crime was not to know that you didn't answer Colin Gunn back without the red mist descending. A huge fight erupted, ending with Colin and another cartel member beating their victim senseless. The group made their way back to the safety of Bestwood, but the reveller reported the incident to the police. They arrested Mr. Gunn at the property on Radley Square, Bulwell, and another man, Kevin Warsop, at a house in Raymale Drive. The duo did not come quietly, fighting fiercely with several officers as they were arrested. This time Mr. Gunn was in trouble. His victim was prepared to pursue a GBH charge, and apparently CCTV footage of the incident was held at the nightclub. Mr. Gunn skipped bail and decided to lay low in Skegness, where his mum had a family caravan and also travelled out to Spain where he had allies who were giving sanctuary. There he could weigh out any possible prosecution, giving him time to do something about the witness statements if the worst came to worst, as within a short space of time the police had issued a warrant for his arrest. The favours included the help of another villain who had some access to the club. This man, who when he was not helping out the brothers was supplying cocaine around the city, got hold of the only CCTV tapes and ensured that they were destroyed before the police could seize them. At a later date, he was able to call on the aid of a doctor who provided Mr. Gunn with a statement that said that he had been prescribed a number of pills for a variety of ailments and that the cocktail of drugs had such a side effect on him that this would explain the violence at the nightclub. It had the desired result. Colin Gunn returned back to Bestwood, faced court and was given a few hundred hours community service instead of a potential prison sentence of 5 years. That same year, Colin and David's sister Julie was involved in an incident which made national headlines and consolidated the reputation of the family you just don't get into an argument with. Julie Gunn went to Henry Whipple Junior High School in Bestwood after her 9-year-old son Sam complained that a teacher had made him sit at the front of the class for being naughty. She disputed with the teacher, Janelle Brown's, account of how much time Sam had been punished for and lashed out, breaking the teacher's nose. Janelle Brown later needed several operations to repair the damage. Julie Gunn was subsequently ordered to perform 240 hours of community service. The story made the Daily Mail in July 1998, raising a debate about violence in the classroom and how a lack of discipline was in the parents. Mr. Gunn apologised and said she had not known what had come over her. "I was annoyed like any other mum would be," she said. "I accept what I did was wrong, and I know how close I came to a jail sentence." Meanwhile, David Gunn, who was living in Leybourne Drive in Bestwood with his wife Sandy, bringing up 3 children with a 4th on the way, was facing problems of his own. Just a month after Colin's nightclub farce, he was about to face the courtroom himself on charges of assault and threat to kill. He had been accused of brutally attacking a man who had dared to get into a row with Sandy in the pub. In November 1997, Keith Copeland had ticked off a child in the standard of the English pub after he heard her make a racist remark. Then he started arguing with Sandy, who claimed he slapped her. David, who was drinking in the pub, exploded with rage. Nobody took liberties with the guns. He launched a sustained assault, knocking Mr. Copeland unconscious and kicking him repeatedly as he laid on the floor. Mr. Copeland, who lived in Bestwood, was left with a broken arm, nose, ribs, and needed stitches to the head. 2 months later, Mr. Copeland tracked down David Gunn to a sporting chance at the Goose Fair pub. There he confronted him and tape recorded him admitting the attack. David threatened to shoot him if he ever saw him again. When the case came to court, Mr. Gunn denied he was even in the Standard of England that night. He said he had in fact been at the sporting chance and had a witness to prove it. But by a majority verdict of 10-2, he was convicted at Nottingham Crown Court of grievously body harm and threats to kill. Mr. Justice Poole, presiding over the case, said that there had been some provocation of Mr. Copeland's part, but added, "This kind of behaviour is quite intolerable and I have no alternative but to send you to prison." On the 27th of November 1998, he jailed Mr. Gunn to 4 years and 9 months. It was a shock to the defendant, who had not expected such a heavy sentence and was desperate to keep out of prison with a baby on the way. He was also suffering from diabetes and had no faith in the healthcare system within the prison. Colin was even more affected by the sentence. Now he would have to run the cartel without the support of his brother. Nottinghamshire police were pleased that one of the Gunn brothers had been taken off the street, but had been preoccupied with taking down other crime groups involved in drugs using sophisticated covert methods, which had resulted in the convictions of Wayne Hardy in September 1998 and would eventually result in the arrests and convictions of Robert Briggs Price and Dave Francis by 2000. The jailing of Francis in particular left a gap in East Midlands drug market from the wholesale to the street level. Colin Gunn could see this was well worth exploiting and set about recruiting middle tier dealers who could negotiate their way through the tribal ganglands of Meadows Estate, St Anne's and Radford. The cartel would move into heroin and cocaine in a big way. The very drugs that Mr. Francis's street dealers had been peddling in large quantities. Having seen 3 members of the Gunn family convicted for criminal offences within a single year, police were about to embark on an operation which, had it been following through the logical conclusion, would have halted David and Colin's growing influence in its tracks and perhaps save lives. The operation would be called Opal, and it already had in its sights the very dealers that Colin Gunn was recruiting. Colin was also working on an audacious plan that he hoped would protect the long-term future of the cartel and their associates. Its success would eventually leave a trail straight back to his door, but for a time it would help the cartel stay one step ahead of the police. The idea came to him after visiting one of his favourite clothes stores in Limeys, in the city centre of Nottingham. As one of the shop's best customers, Colin had become very friendly with the two employees, Jason Grocott, store manager, and one of his sales assistants, Charles Fletcher, an impressionable young man. He had an expensive taste for clothes. When Charlie told Mr. Gunn one day in the summer of 1999 that he was leaving the store for good, Colin asked what he planned to do next. "I'm going to join the boys in blue," Mr. Fletcher told him. Mr. Gunn couldn't believe his ears. He already had some useful contacts in the police, even if Mr. Fletcher never became a detective as he planned. Another lost soul in the force would be extremely beneficial. By filling the vacuum left by Dave Francis's conviction, cartel was taking more risks, and it was imperative to stay on top of the game. Another secret source of intelligence would be very welcome. Whether Charlie Fletcher knew it or wanted it, he was about to become a clean skin for the Bestwood cartel. To refuse would be more than impolite.